So, how to enrich a curious, committed community of people who are up to missional accompaniment and discernment. This is my sense. I took a look at the charter of faith formation that has come out of conversation in the Episcopal Church. I noticed there 3 passages drawn from John's Gospel. All 3 of them have God as the subject of the sentences. It's amazing to join a people that are convinced that God is alive, that God is present, and that God is active, and that presence, that living activity, is in fact shaping this particular tribe in this particular time and place. It's sacred ground to be among you. So I wonder, as you become investigative teams, what's it like for you to work at the same time text and context? So if you should join each other in conversation this afternoon around God in the world and God in my life, it would be fascinating to listen to the discourse. How would you talk about that? What language would you use to speak of this living God at work in your life, your community, the world, beyond history? And so I would imagine that in these next 3 months, when you're carrying on the investigation of the world as theological anthropologists, that you might also be carrying on a conversation with one another around Lectio Divina, around common prayer, as to God's guidance in terms of your perceptions, your sensibilities, the world that is God's place of action that unfolds in front of you. So I encourage you as a team to think about how the discourse might be informed by those ways in which God speaks into your life, the life of your community, and the life of the world. We know what some of those are. In your great tradition, prayer. Not just an individual praying, but a community coming together to pray out of a past, to pray into a present, to pray into a future, and to do that with a certain discipline. In fact, these days, as I listen to persons who oftentimes have had no background in terms of the Jesus story, drawn into the Jesus story because of the disciplines and the liturgies of your life of prayer. So I'm going to imagine, as you pick up your investigative process, that one part of the discourse will be the committed, living God action that is at work in your life and the world in which you're going to be investigating. I don't know how you'll do that. I have some hunches given your commitments, but I encourage you to take that up with one another as you lean into the next 3 months. Perhaps Lectio Divina, perhaps dwelling in the Word, perhaps a discipline of prayer, perhaps mutual conversation of the saints. I don't know how that will go, but I have a hunch that your investigation will not simply be anthropology, it will be, in fact, theological anthropology, theological curiosity about the world. So, how do I imagine working with you this afternoon and tomorrow in a way that might be value added for your already existing tough-mindedness and curiosity? How might we do this? One of my purposes is to open up for you more fully and to enrich your capacity to look for signs of God's presence and activity out there, even as you experience that in and among yourself as a worshiping community. How to be attentive to God showing up, to those other disciples as Jesus talked about them, to those places where in surprising ways God shows up and you build an altar to name the fact that this place is in fact sacred ground. So one of the tasks that we have as investigators is to be curious about where God and Jesus Christ is out ahead of us. I hope to enrich that purpose. Second, my understanding of what Jesus did and what God has been up to across time is to enter into the messiness of human existence, not shy away from it, and be aware that a whole lot of good news is good news because it's spoken in and among the messiness of human existence. And so to be an anthropologist is to get at the isness, a thick description of the messiness of the one real public world in which folks carry on everyday existence. Some talk about that as need. One can talk about that as suffering. One can talk about that as just curious interest. Or one can talk about it as what is it, in fact, that matters in terms of quality of life in the midst of all of life's ambiguity. Need. So alongside of discovering the surprising presence of God, alongside of discovering the messiness and what the shape of that messiness is, I think also comes the question of in what form, in what language does one go about carrying on the activities of a living, present God as a community of faith in today's world? How shall I speak of God in ways that will, in fact, connect with common meanings with those who may, in fact, be our language instructors as we listen deeply and observe what's going on? What languages? What actions? What consciousness? I don't know if you've ever been in the presence of someone who hasn't actually said it, but you get the idea that they see themselves as being way better than you are, and you have nothing, in fact, in common with their high place of existence in a world where they are, in fact, the haves, the celebrities, and somehow the rest of us don't measure up. People don't have to say that. One can, in fact, in their very presence, experience it. I've had an opportunity to be in the presence of Mr. Trump more than once. And it doesn't take very long before one just feels it in one's sensibilities as one's with persons like Donald Trump. So, surprising show up of God in the world as an enterprise of expectation, an opportunity to discover what the real stuff of the isness of messiness looks like and what language shall we use. But there's still yet, for me as an anthropologist, a theological anthropologist, another incredible value in being there on the ground, and that is to discover the incredible giftedness that God has, in fact, put in human beings everywhere. My guess is, through deep listening and observation, you may very well, as you work with your target audiences, develop resources, gifts, spiritual gifts, and others that may in fact become the profound stuff of what becomes the strength of what you do. So you might discover in the openness, in the questioning, in the ongoing struggles, the strengths that in fact may feed into what it is you're going to be doing. Let me use a story to capture this before we get into the nitty-gritty of it. I'm on an airplane coming out of Melbourne, Australia, huge 747-400 loaded to the gills with fuel so that the wings are hanging down and they actually go up as the plane hangs now in the wings. And not being an engineer, I'm believing they're going to fall off. You can't move the tips of those wings 4 feet and not have the metal break, according to a theologian. Good thing I didn't build the plane. So we get in the air, and we're not more than about 45 minutes in the air, and the people on board, the staff, serve us a meal to put us to sleep so we can sleep for a good chunk of the 14-and-a-half-hour ride into Los Angeles. As we're served our meal, I'm crammed in one of those center back seat sections where I've got huge human beings on both sides of me. And as we get our meal, I turn to the person who's next to me, and I say to him, "So, do you go to church?" I've got a captive audience. He's seat belted in. He's got his meal in front of him. And so I never know when I ask that question quite what comes back. Here's what came out of his mouth. "Funny you should ask. We just stopped going." So I said, "None of my business. But why did you quit?" And he said, "Well, we've been Presbyterians all of our lives. We live in Long Beach. We have children who are 9 and 11. This is a prime time for us to be engaged in a faith community. But about 6 weeks ago, we came home from Sunday. We were having Sunday brunch and roast preacher, and we looked at one another, and we said to each other, so what happened today? Whatever happens as we enter and become a part of this community, what actually goes on here? Did anything matter today out of what we did in anyone else's life, in our life?" And we asked not only each other, my wife and I, but also the children, and we did, at the end of it all, a vote. One of these kind of quick thumbs up, thumbs sideways, thumbs down. And in the great busyness of their lives, is this something we wanted to continue to do? And all 4 of them didn't vote thumbs up, thumbs sideways, they voted thumbs down. And so they decided in the busyness and the stuffness of their lives, they would eradicate this particular activity. Sounds like Bridget Schulte in her best-selling book not more than a year ago called Overwhelmed. One of these families making decisions around priorities. So I said to him, "It's an interesting story. When you quit, did you go talk to your pastor?" He looked at me and said, "Who are you?" And I said to him, on the one hand, I'm just curious. You are so interesting. Then I fessed up and said, "If you want to really know, I'm a God cop." I'm a seminary academic dean. And so then he said, "Why should I go talk to the pastor?" Well, I said, it could very well be the case that your experience might, in fact, matter a great deal to your pastor. Not only in terms of what you're experiencing, but you're no longer being there. So we had a bit of more conversation about why he quit. Fortune 500 company consultant had just negotiated with a mining company in Australia and a foundry in China, a massive contract. This is what this man does. And he said, the reason I quit church was Sunday after Sunday, what was going on in the community, the buzz, what went on in the liturgy, such as it was, and what went on in the sermons, never intersected with the intersections of the real stuff of my life. As a person in the public world, as a person wrestling with the busyness of our family, as a person wrestling with my own identity. 52 years old, living on the top edge of middle essence. So we just quit. So I gave him my card and I said, "Why don't you go talk to your pastor?" I thought, when we get off the plane in Los Angeles, I'll never hear from this person ever again. About 2 months later, I get a call. This is Craig in Long Beach. I don't know any Craig in Long Beach. And he could read through the phone, my sense of incredulity. And he said, remember the plane ride? Oh, yes, I remember the plane ride. He said, I went to see my pastor. And I was supposed to say something, I guess. There's this long pause. And then he said, so we got into it. He said, my pastor listened. And as he and I dialogued, out of the dialogue, we got into, first of all, what it was like to be me. He followed the words on message. And pretty soon he said, we were talking about what happens at the table when I'm negotiating a contract, and people look down the table and not only expect me to know something about international law, but they want to know something about Enron. You know about Enron. They want to know about integrity and ethics in the business world. It's now a part of the curriculum at the Harvard Business School. And so I told my pastor, I come loaded with questions. And I wanted to significantly engage the realities of my wonderment and the world in which I live. Talked about, further they got into his hopes and desires for his children. He and his wife having hardly any time at all for themselves in the preciousness of this life and so on. And then his pastor said to him, so will you be a part of my sermon week after next? So after some negotiation, they put 2 stools up in front of the sanctuary, and the pastor heard and interviewed Craig into voice. After the service, 17 people came up to Craig and said, that's my story, and we're that close. We're that close to quitting. And then, out of those 17 people, the pastor unrelentingly stayed with Craig and said, what should we read, and how do we go about putting together a group of the curious to start getting at some of your questions? So today in Long Beach, California, Craig, who left, is the spark plug of a whole new community of really tough-minded people who are getting at living into the questions of what it means to do business in a global society out of many cultures, because in his tradition, he's now got the world and the gospel kissing one another in conversation. That's what I want to do with you. I don't know how to do it in terms of how you do it, but I've learned from my background as an anthropologist, and I've learned from the experiences I've had with Craigs of this world, that we can, in fact, be curious, committed, missional accompaniers in discernment. Let me just say a word about each of those before we get started. Committed. I come down someplace in the world, and my identity is profoundly shaped by what God in Jesus Christ has done with my life. I have been baptized. I've died and been born again, and I am in fact now ushered into a new life here and forever. I've not only been baptized, but I have been drawn into a grand narrative that has assertions, but it's full of questions, and it is an incredible narrative that has to do with the wholeness of the world and the peculiarity of tribes like Episcopal, as well as my tribe, Lutheran, and John's tribe, Roman Catholic, yeah. So, committed. My being a scientist is not simply without some bias. But secondly, curious. For me, curiosity is this incredible gift that means there's nothing that's not worth looking into or getting after or wondering about or pursuing and creating a thicker and more, if you will, interesting and particular sense of what is it that's going on here. So what I hope to do with you as we take a look at these 6 tasks is to think about how curiosity can in fact feed curiosity, so that you live the questions in ever more rich and thoroughgoing fashion. I rarely find a biased asking of the questions to become ultimately helpful, because the person who asked the question seemingly has an agenda someplace that they're trying to get me, in fact, to be a part of. I'm really curious, and I'm interested in what's going on. I hope we can enrich that. Accompaniment. As a researcher, I rarely ever interpret my data without the help of the subjects from whom the data has been drawn. I don't think it's fair to turn subjects into objects. And so I want to think with the persons with whom the data, the information that's drawn, what is it like to feed back to them what I've heard and to have them interpret it and have them help me with an understanding of where this data goes. So, committed curiosity that is in fact accompaniment, and that in fact in accompaniment leads to asking the question, so where might constructive shared activity lead us? Let's say that your target audience might be some subgroup of intergenerational relationships and conversations. I would hope that the investigation of this summer would not only create and develop data, but also establish a set of relationships that could in fact become one of the first steps into the place that you might be taking your project. Accompaniment. Finally, discernment. I don't know if you've ever looked at a situation, sized it up, and decided on the basis of what you've seen, this is what's going on there. And then you spent more time with the situation and you've discovered, no, that's not what's going on, this is what's going on. And you spend some more time, and as you're there longer, you discover, no, there's more going on here. I find, as a 72-year-old, that the ongoing journey of working with a world that's full of options and possibilities is an incredibly valuable place for not perhaps wisdom so much as discernment. Who do I need together to be thinking our way into constructive, value-added decision-making? So we're going to take up now the rest of our time leading you into or working with your process that you will best use that enables you to be, I hope, better at what my bias is in these activities, a committed, curious, missional accompanier in search of shared discernment. Those are critical value words for me. So with that, take up your materials that you have in your packet. You'll have a handout, Way of St. Paul Research Guide. Way of St. Paul Research Guide. And it's 8 pages, okay? I think it's pink, or some, if you will, variation on red. Here, this gentleman's got one. It'll look like this, all right? Okay, you'll need it. Get a hold of it, okay? There are many ways of doing this, and to bring together a kind of motley crew of persons on a task force doesn't mean you get particular background and expertise in anthropology. So I'm going to lay out with you this afternoon so you see the whole, if you will, movement, the arc, the possible ways of going about enriching the understanding of the isness of the situation where you might, in fact, now want to know more as you carry on your project. So what we're going to look at processes for doing these 6 activities. First, gathering demographic information about the congregation. And we're going to take a look at just a bit of what that means, but I'm going to expand that to gathering demographic information also about the surrounding community, because those two often interact with one another interestingly. And we're going to spend a little time this afternoon asking what do we mean by demographic information? What kind of demographic information might be helpful? So that's, if you will, already existing information about the congregation and its immediate context. Observing the people in the wider community. We're going to take a look at how to do a drive around, how to do a walk around, how to go about being a keen observer without being an ogler. This kind of work can be offensive to some people, like a paparazzi. But it also is exceedingly valuable. I mentioned Bridget Schulte and her best-selling book of a year ago, Overwhelmed, journalist who has perhaps, particularly in terms of the lives of women, described best that phenomenon of our time whereby through the power of transmedia, we have in our lives all the time way more than we can ever, in fact, digest or work with. And so what occurs is that almost everyone talks about, my life is out of balance. So what is it like to observe, for example, one of these 10 kinds of families or more, and to see what's going on in just the way in which they go about taking on and making it through, as they say, a day, a week, or so on. It's interesting to do some observing of how that all works and what goes on. John has already, and several of you have mentioned, what it's like to go to a soccer game and observe a parent. It's also interesting to go to a soccer game and observe a coach, or to go to a soccer game and observe players, or as I do up in the upper Midwest, a hockey game and observe hockey. There's a whole, if you will, ethic being taught out on the ice, and it's amazing to see how that all gets worked out and so forth. So we're going to invite you to do some thinking about what a walk around, a drive around might look like, and what it is you want to be watching for. Thirdly, interviewing selected church leaders. We're going to develop a process, set of questions. First of all, selecting church leaders, then a set of questions, and then a process of, if you will, gathering and recording that data, and then a process of factor analyzing that data so that one can see what that data says, and then checking that out with the persons you've interviewed in terms of trusting that information that comes out of leaders. Next, we're going to encourage putting together some focus groups of people in your target audiences. And we're going to think about not just people within the congregation itself, but people also who are rubbing shoulders with people in the congregation. So, for example, I'm doing one of these action research projects with a UCC church in a highly educated section of St. Paul, where they have 4 major colleges and universities around this little neighborhood church. And one of the really most fascinating enterprises that's taken place is that the persons who attend the church have invited their neighbors to a conversation about faith about the role of church in the world. And it's become just a fascinating, ongoing conversation or dialogue that has, in fact, become a major part of their ministry. Just they're using their relationships as an opportunity for dialogue that's been wide open. And they're going in all kinds of differing directions. So we'll think about who you want to include as stakeholders from the target audiences in terms of focus groups, or if you want to do focus groups at all. Out of that, produce a summary report of observations, interviews, and focus groups. And here's how we'll do this. We'll take a look at how to go about, when one looks at the data, identifying individual particular items and making a list of those. And as one reads the data, to pay attention to whether those individual items, whether it's same language or same message, come up again and again and again or not. So a list of items, and also then an indication of, if you will, the valence or the force of those particular items. Okay? Thirdly, to begin to ask, do any of those items and those clusters of items relate to one another, speak to one another? What if the data gets into dialogue with itself? Is there anything here that we can learn? And then as you work with those themes to ask, what does all of this tell us about our intentions, about our interests with the target audience? So we'll be able to work with the interpreting of whether that's notes that come from the walk around, the observations, whether that's information that comes from the interviews, or whether that's information that comes from the focus groups. And where this will all be going is that it will be together with that sheet you just filled out, that green sheet, in terms of the kinds of early sense of what are the strengths, what are the needs, and what in fact might be an area of interest for you in terms of your target audience. It all will feed into and become a part of the substantive information that will feed into your project. Let me stop there. Have you been along with me so far in terms of the process? Okay? Questions that you might want to ask that would be important for you to get after at this point? Those of you who are behavioral scientists will recognize this as a harvesting of a number of behavioral science investigative processes that we've put together. Okay? All right. Let's get you to work just briefly on some aspects of this. Okay? Let's turn to, in your materials, turn to page 3. Okay? 3 of your pink materials. What we've done here is to give you a bit of an indication of the kinds of things you might want to be looking for in terms of church demographics, in terms of ethnic diversity of church members, in terms of age diversity of church members. What I'd like to have you do for just maybe about 5-6 minutes is to talk with one another about what else and where would you go online in the community to get the kind of demographic information that would help you think about your project. Matters such as gender, age, occupation, socioeconomic indicators, etc. You see what I'm talking about? Okay? Talk about that a bit and make a list of what might be the best sources that you would go to in your community to get this information, both in terms of within the congregation and within the community. Have at it. Tomorrow afternoon, we're going to do some specific work with action steps in terms of each of these. I want you to get a sample of it today so that as we look at the whole and work with the specifics tomorrow, you'll have some sense of where we're going. So in the interim, as I was as you were talking, a couple people said to me, so do you mean just the physical space, the geography around the campus? Or what about if our people come from a variety of differing places, 10 miles away, 15 miles away, 20 miles away? Yes, yes. That is, as you do this thinking, to take into account the thickness of the reality of your church as membership, okay? The physical space, the place where you, in fact, come together for worship and so on, will matter, but also the place, the environments where your people are carrying on their lives will also be significant, if you will, communities, surrounding communities. So to think about that as you get after the demographics. Let's go to page 4 and just sample this a bit. Okay? Page 4, top of page 4. Let's just spend a bit of time thinking about what a walk around or a drive around an observation of a community might look like. Engage the team in becoming anthropologists by observing people in the community. Develop an observation checklist and ask team members to spend a month simply observing people at work, at school, at play, at stores, in coffee shops, and restaurants, and so on, watching for things like popular activities. What are some of those most popular activities? Where do people gather outside of work or school? Where do people work? Where do people work? What are some of the most well-attended churches in the community? And what's that about? Where are people on Sunday morning? It's a beginning list. I mean, it's fascinating to think about that last question. Where are people on Sunday morning? I have lived in 3 very discrete human eras. I grew up in an agrarian age on a family farm in North Dakota. We worship where I now worship in a major metropolitan area according to agrarian rhythms. We had worship at 10, 11 o'clock on Sunday morning because why? We had to milk the cows. We couldn't worship early, or we couldn't worship on Sunday evening because we had to milk the cows. So much of what we're still doing, for example, doesn't fit at all into the life of my granddaughter, who works for the One Campaign in Washington, D.C., for whom worshiping on Sunday evening is a far more meaningful process of coming off the weekend and moving into the week. So it's fascinating just to start looking at some of these basic kinds of questions. So I want you to go back to your group and spend a little time asking who might be doing this observation? Who would you have doing this? And how would you get them ready to be observing keenly and carefully the kinds of machinations, relationships that would help you? Spend a little time talking about who does this? How would you do this? Where would you go? A couple of things, and then we go into tomorrow. I've done this by simply planting myself at a coffee shop, a Starbucks, for about an hour and a half. And just watching what transpires in front of me, and rather than knowing what's going on, to speculate what may be going on. And then I discover that I'm not the only one who's doing this, that other people are doing this as well, and that I discovered that Starbucks itself is doing this, and it's not only doing this to, in fact, sell more products. Of course, it's doing that, but it's posturing itself as an incredibly interesting organization, including using language that looks a lot like our tribe. Mission, a quality of relationships, supporting their employees. Now, I have a question about some of it, but it's fascinating to see what this kind of anthropological modeling is in fact telling others, and it can in fact, I think, tell us. What would it be like, I asked a congregation, to put Starbucks right smack in the sanctuary after the 11 o'clock hour? And so they tried it. What they did is they put together some incredibly sophisticated coffee carts. And just simply as the postlude was opening up, they had an instrumental group that did some chamber kind of music, and they wheeled out the carts with some of the finest coffees and just head at it. And now there's as much community after the worship as there is in the worship. And the young adults that have told each other about this place, they don't have to pay $5.60 a cup for it. It's in fact wheeled out. You maybe wouldn't do it that way. I don't know that I would have ever thought about it. But they observed what was going on at Starbucks, and they wheeled it into the ongoing conversation that comes out of worship. Well, tomorrow what we're going to do, when all the others have been able to come, we're going to spend a significant amount of time going through each of these 6, and as we go through them, you will make some decisions, some early decisions about action steps that you choose to do in terms of carrying these out. I fielded several questions along the way about possibilities of what these mean. We'll get at those questions tomorrow.